Hello, thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Imran Kodabokas and I'm a Senior Associate Solicitor here at the Family Law Company. I'm a team leader at the Children and Domestic Violence team. I'd like to also thank my colleague Hannah Porter, who works in my team. She's an Associate Solicitor, and together we hope to give parents some practical advice about contact arrangements during this COVID-19 crisis. We all know that we are in an unprecedented time. We are experiencing lockdown at least for another 3 weeks, and we both hope that we can give parents who find themselves struggling with questions about how to comply with court orders, practical tips. We hope that we can give those parents some practical advice. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Imran, for setting the scene to start us off this morning. I'm now going to share with you some sensible measures you can take to deal with arrangements for your children in this current situation. It's important that parents are aware of the following government guidelines. Do not go out at all if you or anybody in your household are demonstrating symptoms. You must self-isolate for 14 days. Avoid taking children to any public places where there could be gatherings of 2 or more people. Maintain social distancing from all others of at least 2 meters at all times. Continue to follow the guidance on self-isolation if your children are vulnerable. And if appropriate, take copies of any court orders and correspondence which set out the contact arrangements you have for your children when travelling to and from contact. I've also got some practical suggestions to help you deal with this tricky situation and follow the government guidelines well. Firstly, communicate regularly and keep communication civil. Good communication is so important, both calmly and clearly explaining your position, but also properly listening to what the other person is saying. Don't listen while at the same time trying to formulate a response or pick holes in their argument. Listen to understand what they're saying and how they feel. People are scared and frustrated with this global crisis, but good communication can make things that bit easier. And when communicating, remember that the priority is your children, ensuring they feel safe, loved, and able to maintain a good relationship with you both. Secondly, if both yourself and the child's other parent are not displaying any coronavirus symptoms, maintaining your regular patterns of contact is perfectly reasonable. The government have specifically stated that children may move to and from the homes of both their separated parents. Both yourself and the child's other parent should of course be socially distancing from everybody else to avoid any spread of the virus. Thirdly, if at all possible to do so, have a conversation with your child's other parent about how you're going to manage this time and what you're going to do if one of you becomes ill. Discuss the ground rules you plan to set out for the benefit of your children to act in a way that conforms with the government guidelines. Have an emergency plan in place should one of you have to self-isolate with the children in your care. Think about how they will continue to maintain a good and healthy relationship with their other parent, particularly if your child ends up having to self-isolate with a parent in which they don't always spend the majority of their time. And if for any reason at all physical contact cannot take place, use other methods to ensure that children maintain relationships with both of their parents. Fourthly, avoid taking the children on public transport. Whenever transporting them to and from contact, use your own car. And when conducting the handover, remain 2 meters away from the other parent. Allow your child to walk from you to their other parent by themselves. And lastly, if you're concerned about any of the coronavirus symptoms in yourself or your children, they should not go to the other parent in case they're carrying the virus from you. Similarly, if you have a legitimate concern that health will be compromised by physical contact, you should try to arrange indirect contact via an app such as Skype or FaceTime. It's not ideal, but it will be the safest option, and it is important to try to maintain a relationship for your child with their other parent as far as you can. However, I do caution you that there's been a recent article from the BBC making it clear that family judges will not tolerate parents trying to manipulate the current situation to prevent one parent from having contact with their child. It's about your child, it's not about you, and as long as it's safe to do so, your child should be able to continue to have a good relationship with both you and their other parent. Now I'm going to hand back to Imran, who's going to explain what to be aware of if you already have a court order in place.
Hannah, thank you very much for those helpful tips. I hope parents who are in the situation will find those useful. I'm going to spend a bit of time now talking about what to do if you find yourself in a situation where you've got a child arrangements order and you're worried about complying with that. What do you do if you've got a court order called a child arrangements order, which sets out where your child should be, how long your child should be with another parent, and how often they see that other parent? That's what normally we see in child arrangements orders. But during this time of crisis, which is at an unprecedented scale, many parents are worried about complying with that court order. One of the key pieces of guidance we've got from the government is called the stay-at-home rules, and they were given to us and the date of the 23rd of March this year. As we all know, because we've had this message drilled into us, is that we need to stay at home whenever possible, unless it's for a really, really important reason. Moving children between two households is allowed under that piece of legislation. So that means if you are taking a child from one household to another, you will not be in breach. Hannah's already given you some really helpful tips about complying with that piece of legislation. But I'd like to spend a bit of time about what goes through your mind when you are thinking about whether or not those court orders can work. What key considerations is the government requiring you to think about? Well, the first is, of course, safety. Is your child still safely able to have contact with the other parent? Is there a risk of infection to that child? Is there a risk of infection to anyone else in the household? And of course, are there any vulnerable groups who your child may be around? It's important to think about those considerations when thinking about whether or not you can comply with court orders. At the center of all of your thoughts is something called parental responsibility. And that's something that most parents share these days, which allows parents to make day-to-day decisions for that child, as long as it's in that child's best interests. And it's that same principle that the government expects you as parents to think about when seeing if you can comply with a court order. So, if you consider your child to be at risk, if there is a risk of infection to your child or to someone else, then you are allowed to vary court orders between you. However, a court and the government have expected parents to be realistic about this. If there really is no safe way of your child spending time with the other parent, then think about other arrangements. Can your child at least speak to that other parent? Can your child at least see that other parent? Or of course, if it is safe, then that court order must be complied with. If it's not, then like I've said, think about alternative arrangements. And that's the very least that is expected of parents in this situation. However, if parents are perhaps misusing the COVID-19 restrictions as a way to frustrate contact, then a court's going to take a very dim view of that. It still leaves it open to that parent to consider applying to enforce that court order. And the onus will then be on the other parent to prove that they had a valid reason, they'd thought about the child's safety, thought about the risk of infection, and really could make it work. So, in short, child arrangements orders can be varied. Use your parental responsibility to think about what is in your child's best interest. If it's safe, if there is no risk of infection, then it should happen. If there are concerns about that, then you can vary it. Maybe you can vary it to FaceTime, other video calling, or at least telephone. If, for example, one household is isolating, then of course you need to comply with that isolation period. But think about what happens afterwards. If that isolation period is finished and there are no risks to your child or to anyone else, then contact should happen.
So we've had some questions in this morning, and I'm going to take the first of these and try to answer it for you now. So let me just read the question out. I'm going to be a granny next month. My daughter is happy for me to see my grandchild when he or she is born, but I am not sure I should. I am not in the vulnerable category. Okay, Well, firstly, congratulations on becoming a granny. That is really exciting news. Even though you're not in the vulnerable category, really the government guidance is quite clear on the fact that people within the same household that a family can be together, but people that are not in the same household, even if they're family, shouldn't be travelling to and from separate households. Even if you've been spending time self-isolating, as has your daughter, there may be occasions when you've come into contact with other people and can pick up the virus. For example, if you've been to the shops or when your daughter gives birth, she's probably going to have other people around her, and you might be able to pick up the virus from them. And then if you go to see each other, you're going to spread the virus between yourselves because you're not living in the same household. I would really advise that you follow the government guidance on this, even though it's hard and this is a disappointing piece of advice for me to be giving you today. Of course, remember that there's Skype, there's FaceTime, there's Zoom, there's no limit on how much time you can spend seeing your new grandchild via video conferencing facilities. But for now, until the government relax their guidelines, I would strongly advise you don't go and visit in person.
Okay, so we've had a question here from a divorced parent that says they share the care with the other child's parent on a 50-50 basis. There's no official order or anything, and they've agreed a rota for some time now, but the other parent wants to change it so that the child spends 7 days in a row with each parent. The problem is that the parent who's asked the question has to go to work, and the other parent's refusing to be flexible about this. So they ask, what can they do? Well, the first thing I'd say is it depends on what type of work you're doing. Think about what was mentioned earlier on. Does your work put you at risk of exposure? If it does, then it may not be appropriate for you to have any type of contact. Also, who lives in your household? If there's someone who is potentially vulnerable, maybe someone who's expecting a child, or there are young children, or maybe there are some vulnerable groups in the other parent's household. Again, it may not be sensible for there to be contact 7 days in a row. So if that's not possible because it's not safe, then actually what that person should be thinking about is alternative methods. So video calling, speaking to the child, spending as much time with that child via video conferencing as feasible and possible. However, if there really is no risk and there is no concern that could be attached to the child or anyone in that household, then it seems to me that this is a issue about contact generally, in which case that parent would have to go to the courts to apply for a child arrangements order about what time they spend with that child.
And another question, again, I'm going to read it for you now. I'm really concerned that the father of my child has said he isn't bringing my son home because they are self-isolating. Is there anything I can do? Well, if the father of your child has said that he's self-isolating because somebody in his household has coronavirus symptoms, then actually your son shouldn't come home to you right now. You should allow the 14-day self-isolation period to pass before your son comes back to your home. Of course, if you were supposed to have contact during that time with your son, then any contact that you've missed because your son has had to self-isolate with his father should be made up by agreement between the both of you. Of course, if after the 14-day period, your son isn't brought back home to you, at that point I would suggest calling a local solicitor such as ourselves, and we can advise you about what steps to put in place. If you don't have a court order, we might want to apply to the court for an order to regulate the contact that you have with your son. If you do have a court order in place, there's steps that we can take to enforce that and ensure that your son comes home to you at the end of the self-isolation period. If you have any immediate and serious concerns for your son's safety and welfare, then do call the police about this, and they might be able to take steps to bring your son home to you. And for the avoidance of doubt, immediate health and safety concerns are not the fact that your son is self-isolating in a household that has coronavirus. That's not the type of safety concern about which you should be calling the police.
So the last question I have today goes like this. I don't feel happy to let my child go to my ex's house. I'm just not sure if I can trust him to keep our little boy safe. We have an order. Is there anything I can do to change it? So by safe, I'm taking it that that child means safe from any COVID-19 concerns. Again, the same considerations apply. Is there a risk to that child? Is it a valid risk? Is there a risk of infection to the child, or from that child being infected by someone else, or the child infecting someone else in that household? Is there a vulnerable group in the other parent's household? Does the other parent have a job where they are exposed to COVID-19 concerns? If those concerns are valid, so there are risks to the child's safety, then yes, you can vary that court order. But a court would expect there to be other forms of contact in place whilst it is not safe, so a temporary measure. And by this, we've talked about telephone contact between the child and the other parent, video calling between that child and the other parent. That's the very least. However, in order to vary that court order and change it temporarily during this crisis, there must be very good reasons, and those reasons must all stem from the safety of the child as paramount, or the risks exposed to anyone else in that household where the child may live. So if there are concerns to other people in the household, to that child, then you can vary it. But if there are no valid risks, or the risks have been alleviated, maybe because an isolation period has come to an end, then contact should be complied with, and contact should revert back to how it was ordered by the court in that court order. So this brings us to the end of our question and answer session. I've got to say, and I know I'm speaking on behalf of Hannah, we've been really inundated with questions about COVID-19 and child arrangements order during this crisis. So we are very sorry if we haven't been able to get an answer to all of you, but we will do our best to reply to you as soon as we can. This also brings to an end our webinar, and on behalf of Hannah and myself, I'd like to thank you both on behalf of the Family Law Company and ourselves for joining us today. I hope that you found the tips Hannah's given you and how the law applies to COVID-19 arrangements when it comes to children and contact. We hope you find this webinar helpful. If you have any questions, please, as ever, feel free to contact us, 01392 421 777. That's 01392 421 777. The most important message, of course, is to keep safe. We are still open for business. We're happy to take inquiries. And if you need anything, you have our number. Thank you very much for joining us today.